So I've talked at a lot of design conferences, and it's interesting, over the years I've gotten very used to starting to present to the top of people's foreheads as they're looking down furiously taking notes. So if anybody wants all of my slides, the link I'm going to talk about, all that stuff is up on my website. So the whole deck, everything is there, so if you feel like you don't need to furiously scribble things down, hopefully that'll make things a little bit easier. So I'm going to do just a quick shameless self-promotion in one slide. So my name is Steve Gates. I am a second-generation creative director, which means that my father was a creative director. I grew up learning typography on a 700-pound cast iron letterpress in my parents' basement, which, yeah, several people will often clap at that almost Amish sort of upbringing in this world. I've been a paid designer since I was 12, working at his agency, which means that I've been designing for almost 20 plus years. A lot of people will see that number and think I look good for 60, but that's why. I've been a creative director for 15 years. I spent about equal time in my career on the agency side as well as client side. Over the span of that time, I've been lucky enough to work with Apple a lot. I think my work's been in like 9 keynotes, 4 commercials. It's in the human interface guidelines, like you name it. I've kind of done a ton of stuff with them, which is something for me I always think is probably the hardest design club in the world to be able to get into. I left the agency world, completely confounded all my friends, and went to go work for Starwood Hotels for 9 years. That was until we hit the first Apple keynote, and then they all started asking if we were hiring. But over that time, we did a lot of kind of really innovative work about keyless entry, kind of building a lot of really great brands. And so I decided, with the sale of Starwood to Marriott, it was time to leave. And 7 months ago, confounded all of my friends and decided to go become the head of design for Citi, because I thought, hey, let's go bring design to a 200,000 person company in one of the 3 most hated industries in the world, because apparently I love a challenge. So over that time, I've spent a huge amount of time designing in digital. You name it, I've designed for it. I was one of the first handful of people who actually designed work for Google Glass, for Apple Watch, like months before it was released to the public. A lot of work in emerging technologies, all kinds of stuff. And for me, like there are 3 parts to any great team, any great process, right? Like I think it's equal parts process, culture, and creativity. And I think that this tends to focus very much on the execution. And so I'm the guy who often comes to the conference about this to talk about thinking. Because I really kind of feel like it's the overlap of all these is where great work happens. And a lot of it today is in the very unsexy way of focusing on things, focusing somewhat on the process of how do you do great work? How do you do great design? How do you prototype? And what goes into all of that? And so part of that is, for years, I have been working with design thinking. And just as a question, how many people either have used or currently use design thinking in their work? That's about what it usually is. It's fascinating to me. Design thinking has become suddenly this very, very hot. I was literally in the cab this morning coming over here. There's that little TV screen pops up for New York City Design Week. First thing that pops up on there real big, design thinking, which I find incredibly funny because design thinking has been around since the 60s, but apparently this year it's the hot thing to do. And so design thinking was come up and kind of made most popular by IDEO in 1970. It was the technique that they used to develop the mouse for Apple and a lot of other things, and they've kind of been the godfathers of this process. One of the first things that we did whenever I came into Citi was we actually went out and partnered with IDEO to help bring design thinking into the entire institution of a 203-year-old company to try to help institutionalize the way that we think about the things that we do. As a result, I am a certified design thinking trainer. Normally, to teach somebody about design thinking and about kind of the work that we do, it is a minimum of a 3-day class just to learn the process, 5 days if you actually want to learn how to teach it. I've got 35 minutes, so understandably, this is just going to hit some of the highlights. But we've developed an entire process to help teach the company how to think. And the funny part is, for everybody in this room, it isn't rocket science, but it is something that often people need, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a while. Design thinking in its most basic form, in its most basic explanation, is that it's a human-centered approach to innovation that brings together what is desirable from a human point of view with what is technologically feasible and economically viable. These are the 3 things that often go into innovation. And innovation to me is a fascinating, insanely overused word because it tends to tip in 2 different ways. Innovation in the place of we are just going to innovate as far as the project that is in front of us. This is the problem with almost every client-side team that I see, is that there is no vision beyond the brief that is right in front of us. Or you get the other one, which is the PR science fiction, what are we going to do in 20 years sort of thing, that just, it's purely that, is science fiction. So for me, it's about how do you balance all of these things, because if you get the viability of the business, the desirability of what people want and what is actually can be built, that's where innovation lives, in the middle of that. And so I think that for me, that is the truest definition of innovation that I've been able to get to, because I see tons of people have really cool stuff in their book that never launches. I see, either it gets killed or it just can't be built. Great, I prefer stuff that actually ships. And so the main tenet of design thinking, which I think gets lost in a lot of the talk about execution, right? We are an industry that is fascinated and enamored with technology. The press will reward the first to use a piece of technology. But for me, technology will never be anything more than a pencil. If you have nothing to say with it, if there's not an idea behind it, if there is nothing to communicate, I don't care how well it's coded, nobody cares. And so for me, the main tenet of design thinking is empathy. To be able to put yourself in your customer's shoes. And there is a difference in understanding observation and empathy, and I see a lot of people get tripped up on this. A lot of people do observation. This is user testing, this is things like that. What do people say and what do they do? That's not empathy. That's user testing. Empathy is that I actually can think and will feel the way that the people who are going to use my product do, which is something fundamentally different. And it's the ability to develop that short-term memory loss to be able to look at something for the first time and understand it. But the basic key of this is just fail faster. Because I think that's one of the biggest things I've had to teach teams whenever I come into client-side engagements, whenever I was on the agency side, was to fail, to create a culture of failure, as strange as that sounds. Because that's the only way you find innovation, is to get it wrong a lot, to lose that idea of we're going to do these big home run projects. This is not the most cliched thing in modern technology, which is the Facebook poster that says move fast and break things. There was not a startup whenever I was looking for a new job that I did not walk into. There was not a company I did not walk into where this was on the wall, which I find hysterical. It sounds very pilot, it's like very rogue, it's very renegade, it's very, this is the new successories cat hang in there for our generation or something. But the funny part is, this didn't even last for Facebook. Because what it turned into was actually being things put over that said slow down and fix your shit. And if you think I'm kidding, that is an actual photo that I took in Menlo Park of the huge move fast and break things poster with the slow down and fix your shit tacked on top of it. And it's because that's the thing, it's the thinking that matters. If you're just running around in a disconnected way, you end up with a mess. And so I think what I'm going to do is just kind of quickly talk about just why, right? Everybody who I'm sure has read the Simon Sinek book runs around with that same question of why. And just a brief history of digital design for context. I think a lot of this started with automated design. This was the old mainframe, standalone business environment design. This was the very functional utilitarian sort of design. That evolved into the application design with the dawn of the PC era. This was more for the home. This was with the Mac Classic. This was with PCs. And it became a very different, more functional but slightly more elegant version of design. Then we've evolved into experience design. This was with the dawn of websites. And it was networked, but it was still in much more of a tethered environment. And then finally we've gotten to our current era of much more dynamic design, often mobile-based. It's contextual and it's untethered. The thing with this last one though, and the keynote this morning hit on it a little bit, is that what a lot of us have stopped doing is we've stopped doing layouts and we've started to design dynamic content containers. Because the days of doing pixel perfect layouts are dead. They've been dead for a long time. So it's how do we work with content and create these structures that are dynamic that can work across multiple touch points that becomes so critical. And this is why I think the thinking behind that becomes even more critical, because the technical complexity to build them has ramped back up. But I think that's why we need it, is just because it's so easy to get lost in all the technology for this. And so design thinking works in a really simple way. It really is just about creativity, lateral thinking, and intuition. And I'm going to kind of press on this a little bit more. It mainly has 3 phases, which is for inspiration, ideation, and implementation. This is a standard creative process that most people will go through. I think a lot of design thinking is just drawing it out and giving it a chart and a process that people can understand. There are many parts that go through it, from what IDEO's classics, how might we? These are the challenge statements, the briefing statements, the things of how might we be able to go through and solve a problem, through all the way through these different steps down into deliver. Like I said, I've got 35 minutes, that's 3 days, so we're really just gonna kind of focus on the middle part of this, but a lot of it is also the way that you go about these ideas. And it's a lot of having diverging and converging ideas, of coming up with a whole lot of ideas, editing it down. Whole lot of ideas, edit it down. How many bumps there are along this process will vary wildly on the complexity of the project. Some of the ones I've done may have had 40 or 50 of those cycles. Simpler ones may have had 3 or 4. It's incredibly scalable. No matter how big your project is, no matter how small, you can use it. But like I said, we're just going to focus on these middle two and talk about this a little bit for ideation and prototyping. Ideating. I think this is where a lot of us kind of make our living, right? In communicating and clarifying ideas through models, sketches, stories. A lot of this is to concentrate purely on thinking before you build. This is the you don't find a concept in Photoshop sort of idea. But the reality is, and I've always believed, I grew up in Pittsburgh, that creativity is a blue-collar profession. It takes work. Everybody has been suckered by this idea. Light bulbs are bullshit. Ideas do not happen this way. But the world has gotten conned, our clients have gotten conned into thinking that there is like this clap of inspiration, it rains champagne and puppies, and all of a sudden we've got the whole thing laid out. This is always the why can't you do it faster sort of a thing. But that's the problem, is that I would challenge anybody, whenever you think about it, that you may have had a moment of inspiration, but to actually get the idea to come to life, whole different animal. Huge amount of work. I mean, this is always the funny part. Whenever I talk at events like this, someone will come up after me and they say, like, what's the secret to working with somebody like Apple? I'll say it's 2 things. Very excited, very wide-eyed. Have great ideas, work your ass off. Watch that enthusiasm melt off their face. As like that was somehow the one thing they didn't want, as if there was an actual secret to things. But this is the thing, right? Creativity's work. And, you know, and for me, I've found that very few people, very few designers, people who have come on my team, very, very senior people, can tell you what their process is. Because one of the tenets that I use for leadership, one of the things that I do to get great work, is that I understand and recognize that everybody creates differently from me. And so how do I create a structure to let that happen? Because if there was a problem that I put to this room, every single person in here is going to use your strengths, your weaknesses, your fears, your inspirations to connect those dots differently. And that's the thing, is that, but can you understand it? Can you summon it on command? Because that's a big part of whenever you look at how to rise up in your career, is your ability to do that more quickly, your ability to have better ideas faster, but it means that you actually have to take the time and have the self-awareness to be able to understand how that happens. So there's an exercise that I do to try to help young people or like designers do this. This is the single most stolen concept I've ever had by quite a long shot. This is also, if you want to terrorize people in an interview and really understand who it is you're about to hire, do this exercise. Because because like for me, most interviews are a popularity contest. Again, bullshit. I don't need more friends. What I need is people who can think. I don't want to hear the script that everybody has. With me, it's the kid, the letter prep, like that whole shtick I opened with, I've got that down cold. I don't care about that. I want to see somebody think. So it's a real simple exercise. And what I do is you get 1 minute to think about the question, and you get 2 minutes to pitch it to me. And what it is just a very simple question of why would a particular brand make a particular product? Very simple. Sounds very easy. And what I'll do is I do it on a board, and I'll write 2 numbers of 1 to 10, or it could be 2 stacks of cards. There are a number of different ways you can do it. The brands are brands that everyone would know. Nike, Apple, Twitter, Facebook, Tesla, I mean, any big brand that you want. The products are purposely comically in their juxtaposition. And I'll give you an example. And so we'll walk in and I would say to you, you have 1 minute to think and 2 minutes to tell me why would Nike make a gas can? Some people will start, and you can see, some people will start smiling and would love to do this. Other people will recoil in absolute fear. That's the moment I want. Because I want to see, whenever it hits the road, can you think? Other examples. Why would Twitter, for instance, make a lipstick? Or why would Audi make an inflatable pool? If we had more time, we could, afterwards, we can actually run this exercise. I do it all the time, but the reason why I do it is because, quite honestly, most people don't understand why this process is important, why creativity is important. This is why design thinking and doing process like this has become so important, is because most people in that moment, whenever they're doing it, are not consciously aware of how to be creative. And that's for the actual people who are in the creative team. And I think that why this is important is because creativity is a team sport. Like it or not, we can suffer and complain about clients all we want. They're the ones that determine if it sees the light of day. And so I think the more you can be an advocate and the more you can be an evangelist to help them be a part of this process, because the base reality is, like it or not, people will support what they're involved in the most simple and basic way. And it takes a lot of confidence and leadership to be able to bring clients up into a process, to be able to make them part of something. But the reality is, it is staggering how much better the work is and how much more frequently it ships whenever you do that. And that's what I said before, is not everyone is used to playing in a team. Like the biggest problem, with 2 huge companies now, I've tried to bring Agile into a company setting. The biggest problem with Agile, more than anything, is that as a creative person, you give me a problem, I'm used to going flying over a cliff and I will build my wings on the way down to figure out that problem, which is then being followed by an entire organization that is used to going from A to B, and they know what B is before they get there. So now all of a sudden, I'm going to throw them over the cliff with me, and they are gonna freak out. Dev is gonna freak out, engineering is gonna freak, everybody, because everybody's used to going from A to B. All of a sudden, we're making it up as we go along. Are you kidding? And that's the inherent problem, is that people aren't used to playing in teams. People aren't used to solving as you go. They're used to having the answers. This is like, I'll show my age right here. This is why hiring millennial designers drives me up the wall. Because you have an entire generation who's been taught that there's a right answer. This is a profession, there's not a right answer. There's a lot of really wrong answers to get to a slightly less bad answer. And I think this is why so often you see projects that start with a solution to be validated rather than a problem to be solved. And this is like the number one thing that I will coach teams on. And my thing is, because if this is not right, if there's not a problem to be solved, if a client comes to you with a solution to be validated, it doesn't matter how good the design is. It isn't going to be as good as it should be. It doesn't matter if you're because all you're doing is coloring in the lines. And this is why whenever I come to stuff like this, instead of just purely talking about how to do the executional part of it, because if this is wrong, it's not going to be where it needs to. And I think the other thing, quite honestly, and this is the hard part, you don't find innovation by knowing where you're going, right? You can copy. There's tons of stuff here where people will go back and say, oh, this person did that, we should do that. Like you want a real short conversation in my office, come in and say, oh, this is our version of another brand's solution. Great, get out, come back when you can actually think for yourself. Too old for this shit. But look, I think that the other thing, though, honestly, is that design thinking, and the reason why I like to talk about this, is there is no greater Trojan horse for change than design thinking. Because I think if you're in an internal client team who's looking for respect, if you're an agency who wants deeper involvement with your clients, the ability to bring them all into a process, to make them part of this does not mean that everybody is suddenly the creative director. But what it does mean is that you can have everybody involved in this to make sure that there is support, to make sure that you can get what you need, and you can completely reposition your relationship with a client, you can completely reposition your team inside of a company, because all of a sudden you go from being the team that was a commodity who could just simply hit a deadline to a team that is a critical asset because you can deliver the value of game-changing ideas. And I think that, for me, has been one of the biggest transformational jumps that I've had to make, is to understand that just like every other digital experience, it's about how do we provide value. And I think there's a lot of it, starts with sketching. Design thinking is big. Like if I'd have known how it was going to make a comeback, I'd invested in 3M and Post-it notes, because it's just, or whatever, a patent for writing on like glass windows in offices or something. But a lot of it's for sketching. And I think one of the things whenever you start to do design, like for me, this is my new, for years I was addicted to Sharpies. Like I'm sure I'm gonna get lung cancer at some point from all the toxic marker fumes I'm inhaled. But for me, like it's the first time with the pencil that I've completely changed my process over to digital. But the thing is that in a lot of cases, whenever you're trying to do it with a group, whenever you're trying to start doing design, it doesn't always kind of work, and not everybody has that tool. So again, we go back to the Sharpie. One of the tricks that I've learned whenever you do sketching, and especially whenever you do it with a big group, is that people love to run to the execution. We're going to sketch out what this is. We're going to draw the button. We're going to say what the button says. We're going to put the asterisk, and we're going to start to write the legal. It's like, you have got to be joking. That's not an idea, that's an execution. Know the difference. So what I'll do is I will get the biggest Sharpie I can find without being like the comically large kind of ones, but the biggest chisel tip Sharpie I can find. And I will pair that with the smallest piece of paper that I can find to physically keep people from going into too much detail. Because until I can train them to stop doing it, I will physically prohibit you from like writing anything in a button. Because as soon as you try and do that, it's just a big smudge. You just see them kind of give up and color it in. It's kind of like when you start to watch afterwards, it's kind of comical. So you'll see like, it'll be like an H and then they just kind of color it in. But I think this is the thing, is to focus on the quality of the thought that goes into your design. And a lot of it is done through sketching. A lot of it is done through just how do we get the idea right before we actually go through and start doing the actual work around that. And so a lot of it, for this was also to be able to talk about prototyping. And I think that prototyping, digital design in general is in a very interesting and kind of frustrating place, I think. And I think that part of it is people just do not understand how and when to do a prototype. And so there are actually 4 different stages that I will use prototyping in. The first one is just for doing design research. And this is really building to think. This is to understand boundaries and patterns, to say, whenever you look at something like Alexa or Siri or Cortana, that if I want to go to away from a traditional bottom mobile nav interface, if I want to go to a spoken word interface instead, where is the boundary for that? What is the adoption rate? How ready are people to be able to do that whenever so many other experiences have ritualized them into thinking that apps function a certain way? Where's the boundary of that? And how sustainable and how much are people actually going to engage with that? So I think that's the part of just simply doing design research to test and try to break my ideas. Like that's most of what I spend a lot of my time doing, is just try to break what it is that I'm thinking about. Rapid prototyping is then the ability to learn. This is the lo-fi sketching. This is the do it with pipe cleaners, do it with a piece of paper, just do it. It's much more about just how do we prototype to learn what people want or to learn what the interaction is. We then have kind of like the live prototyping. This is to communicate, to examine if the product's a market fit. This can be, again, it can be lo-fi. These start to become more clickable. These start to become something where we can just start to say, okay, is this something that the market will look at? And then finally, you have the live pilot. This is the getting ready for launch. This is the hi-fi prototype before we'll send it into dev. But a lot of it is just continuing at these different stages to test and try to break the thinking to make sure and validate along the way. I think most people will only usually do number 4, which means if you have a problem, a little too far down the road. And then all of a sudden there's the big blow up, we have to back up, what are we going to do? All of a sudden it's version 2.0, which FYI, clients and customers don't understand 2.0. They understand the version that's actually live in their device. And if it doesn't work, you get the reviews that correspond with that. They don't care that like, oh, we'll fix it in 2 months when the next release goes out. Don't really care. For us, we test prototypes every Tuesday. One of the things I've learned, if you want to bring design thinking into a huge organization, design is subjective, design is debatable. The one thing that isn't is putting it in front of customers. So every Thursday, wherever things are at, test it with customers. Take away whatever that is, go work on it, do it again. Because that way I don't have big debates. I don't have things that are going on for weeks at a time. I can put it in front of people and say, is this working or not? And we can get a good idea around that. I think that you have to make sure that you stay focused on the problem that you're trying to actually solve and be very clear about that. Because a lot of times prototypes will wander off into doing a whole host of other things. We'll wander down a side street. We'll kind of do all these other things. And so to really stay focused on what you're trying to solve, don't over-create the prototype and get lost in the technology. Again, this is everybody likes a shiny new tool. Everybody gets very enamored with the way something animates in. If the functionality doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Like if it looks cool when it comes in, if I can't use it. And so again, this is to test to make sure that people can use it. This is not to test that your engineer can actually animate something the way that you want. Be sure that there are no flaws. Biggest thing I see people get tripped up on, they do prototypes. They want to try to do a really great innovative idea. It's something they are really passionate about. Put the prototype out there. There was a mistake in it. Something, the flow was wrong, a click was off, something which suddenly the client, the customer, whoever it is, will use to beat you to death about that's why your idea doesn't work. Because the reality is that everybody is about innovation and change. Every client, everybody is about innovation and change right up until the moment where it means they actually have to do something different. This is why I left agencies. I got so tired of kind of like showing up with the great idea and going, here it is. I mean, we're all about innovation. We're all about change. Think outside the box. Great, here it is. Whoa, 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 whoa. This means we have to do something different. Yeah, that's what innovation is. Well, let's see, can we just kind of simplify this down? So again, I think, that's out there. Like, people are gonna root for this stuff because great ideas are fragile. They need friends. They can be destroyed incredibly quickly, and something as simple as a flaw can blow that whole thing up. And I think, a lot of modern design apps, Proto.io, I know who's one of the sponsors, Sketch, InVision, drive me insane. Because I think, this is why, like, my wife finds it really funny that both Grumpy Cat and the real Darth Vader follow me on Twitter, and she says that really says something about me. But the problem is that design tools are stuck in the past. They have not kept up with the way that design actually comes to life. I think that you see Sketch with artboards has gotten much closer because now I can have multiple screens. You saw Adobe try with Reflow to be able to design those fluid structural systems. But in so many ways, we're still designing flat screens for dynamic containers, and the disconnect between that is maddening. I think this is why in so many cases, the best prototyping is a lot of times going through a lot of this lo-fi prototyping to be able to get to the end whenever I can then sit down with an engineer and start to be able to kind of work through the working system of this stuff. I mean, I think like if somebody wants to go out and make a startup that is going to make a lot of money and that I would be happy to back, try to figure out how do you start to create design tools that account for dynamic systems, because this way of doing things is getting old. But I think, so that the state of modern design as it stands right now is a few things. I think one is that it's streamlined. A lot of it tries to be vector-based and more intuitive tools. This is why you see the popularity of Sketch over Photoshop. Because in a lot of cases, when people look at Photoshop, it's like, yes, I would love a tool that could do web design and 3D printing and character animation and title and it's like, okay, too much. And so I think that's why you've seen the rise of this, and I think you've seen such rampant adoption. One of my friends, who's one of the design evangelists at Apple, said that 2 years ago, 80% of the work they saw came in Photoshop. This year, 80% is in Sketch. And I think because there is such a significant change that's taking place there. I think obviously interaction and prototypes has become it's become a critical part of this, because just looking at flats does not help me understand if things are actually working the way that they should. Live previews, the ability to actually then take those designs and be able to interact with them quickly. And finally, the ability to share. Again, send it out to a team, put it up on Slack, do something so that I can actually get it out and get it socialized. And so I think there are 3 tools that I think show a lot of promise. They aren't kind of my Valhalla quite yet. One of the ones that I think is interesting, I will openly admit that I'm on the advisory board trying to help Adobe build this, has been what is now their XD platform, which basically looks at how do you combine a design surface with a prototyping surface all in one app. So the ability to fluidly flip back and forth between the two, so that if I go in and I look at my prototype, then I can actually see how it's functioning. I can flip back to the design surface and then actually make that change. And there's some interesting tools that they've come up with. So the ability, like if I have this menu ordering screen and I decide that I actually like to add another row to that they have this thing called repeatable grids, so that it actually understands that that is a grid that I can then just simply pull out and make more of. And they're working towards the ability to also populate this with live data, which would be obviously incredible, since so much of content and things like that is a really dynamic sort of idea. But again, I think this is in the early stages. You can get it from Adobe's website. It's in beta. If you have a Creative Cloud membership, you can get it for free. But I think it shows a huge amount of promise. It shows that I think that somebody at Adobe is awake, because I screamed at them for years, and Reflow broke my heart, to try to understand that design has changed. The world has moved on. The era of the big bloated platform is gone, and I think Eric Stone, what a lot of other guys there are doing, is absolutely fantastic for this stuff. Another one is Silver, and this is a plugin for Sketch that was recently purchased by InVision. Silver actually does a very similar thing, but it lets you do this all inside of Sketch. So even do simple things like the ability to quickly define a header and a footer in a long page comp so that you can actually see how that works. To be able to do a lot of kind of basic animations, to be able to do modals, to be able to do different things like this that I think just kind of make it as a nice, again, just as I'm designing, all within the same application, I can flip over and to be able to start testing this. Like one of the things I love doing whenever we're prototyping is to actually just run this live, and then as people give us feedback, make the adjustment, next person comes in, try it again. And so that we can just literally iterate on the design as we go while we're in testing. But the ability to do modals and some other things like that is really nice. Like I said, they were recently purchased by Envision. Right now it's only in private alpha. If anybody really is interested, let me know. I can ping them and get somebody into that alpha if you want. But it is, whenever you go into Craft, which is if you use Sketch and you don't have Craft, go download it today. Because again, the ability to go out and to use dynamic and live data, the ability to kind of do a lot of really good things, but that's why at the bottom where it says prototype coming soon, is because that's where Silver will be going whenever it comes in. And the last one is Principle. And I think this is one that not a lot of people have heard about. There are two engineers from Apple who actually created this. And Principle is probably my favorite tool right now, just because I think it does a fantastic job of not just giving me basic screen transitions, but as I move into the process to do complicated high fidelity prototypes. And again, a lot of the upfront process that you're seeing here is the same thing that you would see in a lot of other applications in terms of just the simple ability. Where it gets interesting is that it has an animation timeline, very similar to Flash if you want to date yourself, After Effects if you don't. But the ability to, hey, I remember when it was Future Splash, don't laugh. But I think the ability to go through and then to be able to do these dynamic prototypes where I can not only tune animation to get it the way that I want, but it has another section called drivers. This was a prototype that I'd made for the W app whenever I was back still with Starwood, which basically will allow you to have behavioral-based animations. So in this case, I can swipe right and left, but I wanted it that whenever it came up for there to be a scrim that would darken the image and that it would start to blur. And so it's a completely dynamic interaction that's based on the Y position of the scroll. So that this is an app that lets you get to incredibly complicated, incredibly sophisticated, really realistic feeling prototypes in a really simple and beautiful way. And again, I think it's still they just hit 1.0 like a month or two ago, but I think kind of a tool to be able to let you create something that is, because literally you can stand up a prototype in minutes. But that's one of the ones I don't see a ton of people using that I've really kind of been liking a lot lately. And so I'm gonna leave a couple minutes for questions, and like I said, I always have to fly through all this stuff. But look, I think at the end of the day, whenever you guys sit in all these sessions, you hear a lot of people, you hear a lot of stuff around execution, you hear a lot of stuff around how to make things pretty and cool. I think that the biggest part for me in terms of teaching design thinking and trying to come to these things is just to walk away with the simple thought from what I said, that like, for me, like comfort is the enemy of greatness, right? Because I think if it comes to design thinking and it comes to being able to do great work, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, I mean, I've gotten to a weird place in my career, like as soon as I start making my clients nervous, I know I'm in the right spot. Like as soon as I'm kind of going, like, this is the idea, like we really like it, but it's kind of, I'm Pitbull, like that is where I need to be. And I just think that, whenever you're thinking about your design, when you're thinking about your execution, how do you become comfortable with becoming uncomfortable? Because I think because at the end of the day, the techniques that we talk about this year will change next year. The technology and the technology landscape this year will be different next year. We're all one keynote away from having to go chase some whole new device, and that's going to be the latest thing that we're going to need to work with. And I think that a lot of this is like, how do you become more agile, to understand that that is the way to be smarter about things, but to also just kind of work and enjoy that space of really kind of being uncomfortable with these things. Because I think that in a lot of ways is the essence of design thinking. It's the essence of a lot of great design. And it's the essence of growing in your career. Is the point whenever I'm doing something that makes me really uncomfortable. It took me way longer than I would like to embrace this concept, to the point where literally, like, I mean, I always will describe it as like embracing my crazy. It took me a long time to realize that was perfectly fine. It got to the point, honestly, where I have on my right arm, which I probably can't show in this jacket, I have Here's the Crazy Ones tattooed on my right arm so that I never forget. Some days it's an affirmation, some days it's a confirmation, but like just to simply remember what I'm here for. Also, because when you're in a client meeting, it makes it real easy for people to know where you're coming from if it's literally tattooed on your arm. But I just think, but it got to that point with me where I felt like I never wanted to be in a place again of just being okay with it being okay. And so like I said, all of the stuff I've talked about today, all the apps I threw up on my site, so just go to stephengase.com/generate. There are links to all this stuff up there. I put a lot of related articles up there. If you guys have heard about the apps that I talked about, there's another article there that's about 10 other design tools you probably haven't that are web-based and a bunch of other things, what I think are the 10 best ones in Sketch right now, and some other ones that I've written about creativity as well, just in the hopes that it helps. I've been ranting to myself, I guess, on my blog for 13 years now. So if any of that is of any interest, please feel free to go and check it out. And with that, I know they have a mic, and we have 5 minutes left if anybody has any questions. I know it's early and I can't be that good that nobody has any question that they'd... Because I know I can hear them, but I know everybody else can.
When you're in the prototyping, in the early stages of prototyping, do you think about when to bring in, like a UX developer, or start thinking about any frameworks? Because depending upon the situation you're in, right? A lot of UX developers are ex-artists, right? So they understand what the creative process is all about.
Right.
They can provide additional insight into the media that the artist may not have. I'm just wondering, because as you were talking about the prototyping, it seemed like keep it very paper-based. Okay, that can work too.
Yeah, and again, I think in the early stages, and so what I will say is, so through the entire process, even if it is just paper-based, for me, it is always design, content, user experience, and engineering tech are all always at the table through the entire process. Partially because I think they all have something very different to offer, and also because I've done this long enough to understand that as something goes from the spark of inspiration to the reality of its execution, it moves wildly. And I think that at every stage, I need all of those to keep each other in check. Also just because I think probably content and tech are probably the two most abused and overlooked professions, because in a lot of cases, like with most devs, and I've found that this is a place to get incredible creativity, because at most places, whenever I come into there, the best they can do is not be noticed. Because like you deliver it and it works, everybody goes, great. No fanfare, it was like, oh, the creative team did this great design. No, that's not really true. So the ability to pull them forward and up into that process, one is, I think, is just an incredible thing, but to me, I need that other perspective. I need to hear, okay, if I'm going to design this, and if you just change this one thing, we would save 200 man hours or whatever it is kind of what I want. So no, for me, like even in the sketching process and all that, everybody's at the table. I'm going to make him work and run up there.
Hi. So I am a millennial designer.
It's not a bad thing. Look, I'm not about characterizations of anybody. It's like when we're talking about trends a lot today, we'll just lump that in with it.
For sure. So what advice do you have for just young designers coming up to either prove that we're not stuck in the mindset of one correct answer all the time, or just to break from what we might have been taught?
The biggest piece of advice that I give, which gets me uninvited back to a lot of design schools, make your career about having ideas, not about having executions. Because I think that the one thing that will never change is that companies want to have an experience that moves their consumer, that generates revenue, and that differentiates their brand. The ability to have that idea, irregardless of the medium, will never go out of style. And I think that's one of the biggest tenets I've tried to base my career on, because if it is just simply chasing the dragon of execution, this is why I don't get invited back, because if it's all about just learning Photoshop really well, don't get me wrong, you need to do that. You need to learn those tools to the point at which they become transparent to your process. Whenever I no longer think about how do I want to design what I want to design, and it can just simply flow. But I think that the ability to have that value, more than anything, will keep your career in a really good place. But I think it's also being diligent to make sure that you are putting yourself in positions and putting yourself on teams where that has value. Because I think it is also an industry that runs rampant with leadership and creative directors who just simply want people to design and to have a process that mirrors what they do. And it is why it profoundly makes me sad that one of the other things I'm asked to talk about most often is leadership. And at most events, like Adobe Max last year, I did that, sold out twice. Made me really sad. Like, don't get me wrong, the ego loved it, but like part of me, just for that there's that vacuum of leadership right now. So I think it's also to just understand that and to be clear more than anything, and this is for more than just millennials, about what makes you different. If you treated yourself as a brand, I see tons of resumes for people who want to list work experience. Again, the world is full of people who can make pretty pictures. I can walk in the streets of New York, throw a rock, and hit 2 of them. Like people who can actually lead, people who can have ideas, people who can do that sort of work are incredibly rare.
Thank you. I think it's on. Thanks.
I'll get you next. You need like a t-shirt cannon, dude. You need to be able to
Just shoot it
Yeah.
over.
I suppose if I was nicer about this, I would try to pick a more linear order.
I see that your work takes a lot on change management and transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So the big question for you is big bang approach or kind of contain change and then apply across the organizations.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that I've found, agency side and every place else, is that Big Bang only works on small projects. If you want to change an organization, if you want to change anything else, I think you have to be able to, again, you have a bit more of a heads-up approach to innovation and to be able to then work towards it. I think it's why it came out during the Samsung trial, but if you walk into Johnny Ive's office, he has the next 5 generations of every product on his desk. Because again, where the iPhone is going to be in 5 generations is not what that is going to be, but they're at least thinking about it in a more evolutionary sort of way. And so I think the ability to have a bit more of a North Star concept for where you want to go and then rally people behind it leads to sustainable change. It leads to multiple projects and alignments over a large organization to be able to kind of actually accomplish that. Because I think the Big Bang falls victim to the science fiction piece. Because we don't have enough budget. Tech can't do it. Our tech architecture can't support that API yet. I mean, there's a million reasons why. I think this is why in client-side teams, the biggest problem is they can't see the forest for the trees anymore because they're so accustomed to the excuses. And so I think that a lot of it is, how do we define that and then work out towards it? Because it'll get you to the Big Bang, but you just have to do it in a bit more of a methodical way with a brand or client of any size.
I think we need to stop it there. We're running over
So
time.
there's a break after this. I'll be happy to hang around. As you can tell, I don't need a microphone. So anybody who wants to have any questions, I'll be happy to hang out and answer them. So thanks so much.